For me, he left a rusty key and a single sentence in the will. Not everything that's old has value. The key chilled my palm, heavy like an iron insult, while his mistress smiled discreetly in the corner of the room. 50 years of marriage turned to dust and rust in front of my children. But what no one there knew was that my late husband was a terrible liar. And that key wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of my revenge. Stay with me until the end to find out what I did. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from your phone, at work, or from your couch at home. It's good to know I'm not alone. My name is Margaret Sterling. At 72, my world has shrunk to the dimensions of this old house south of Broad, to the precise needs of my orchids, and to the vast echoing silence left by my husband, Arthur. The Charleston morning air, thick with salt from the harbor, and the sweet perfume of my conservatory used to feel like a promise. Now, 3 months after Arthur's passing, it just feels heavy, another layer of weight on my chest. My days are measured by the rising sun on the water and the slow unfurling of new leaves, a quiet rhythm of survival that I observe but no longer feel a part of. My hands, which once identified the most delicate variations in orchid species for botanical journals, now feel clumsy and old. They tremble slightly as I mist the Phalaenopsis. Their skin is thin and veined as a bee petal. Arthur used to say these hands could coax life from stone, yet they couldn't hold on to him. This house, filled with the antiques and art we collected over 50 years, is no longer a home. It is a museum of a life that belonged to someone else, a woman who believed she was cherished, a woman who was not me. The phone rang at precisely 9 o'clock as it always did. It was my son, Daniel, calling from Atlanta. His voice had the same sterile efficiency as the emails he sent. Mother, R.E. You ready for this afternoon? The car will be there at 2. Please be on time. There was no warmth, just logistics. He spoke of the reading of his father's will as if it were a quarterly business review, another item on a checklist. To him, grief was an inconvenience to be managed, and I, his grieving mother, was the primary asset requiring oversight. I was sitting at Arthur's mahogany desk, the one he rarely used at home, when Daniel called. In front of me was the letter from the law firm. The paper was thick, creamy, and cold to the touch. It felt impossibly formal for something that was supposed to be the final word of a man I had shared a bed with for half a century. A line from one of our last conversations surfaced. Unbidden. He'd been signing papers, his brow furrowed. I'd asked if everything was all right. It's all taken care of, Margaret, he'd said, not looking up. Don't you worry your pretty head. The memory, once reassuring, now felt like a locked door. A creeping doubt, cold and insidious, began to wind its way around my heart. Had I ever truly been a partner in our life, or was I merely the curator of its beautiful facade? The perfect hostess, the supportive wife of the great shipping magnate, the mother who set aside her own career in botany to cultivate her children's futures. I was Margaret Sterling, a name that felt more like a title than an identity. A title that, I was beginning to fear, was about to be revoked. I retreated to my conservatory, my sanctuary of glass and wrought iron. The air in here was different, alive, breathing. I ran my fingers over the waxy leaf of a ghost orchid, a rare, beautiful thing that blooms under the most specific, difficult conditions. It clings to the bark of a tree, its roots exposed, drawing everything it needs from the humid air. It has no leaves for most of its life, appearing dead until it produces a spray of ethereal white flowers. A survivor. I felt a strange, painful kinship with its stubborn, silent life. Living in Charleston means living with ghosts, the ghosts of history, of old families, of unspoken rules. The primary rule for a woman of my station was to maintain composure, dignity above all. The widow of Arthur Sterling was expected to be a portrait of quiet, graceful sorrow, a fragile figure in pearls and muted colors. But beneath the surface of that expectation, a tremor of pure, undignified fear was starting. I was afraid of what I was about to find out. Not just about Arthur's money, but about the very foundation of my life. Before the car arrived, I stood before the hall mirror. I had chosen a simple gray silk dress, the one I wore to garden club meetings. It made me feel faded, indistinct, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The woman looking back at me had clear blue eyes, but they were clouded with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. For a terrifying second, it felt like I was looking at a stranger, and a cold dread washed over me. I had a sudden, chilling certainty that this stranger in the mirror already knew how the day would end. The drive to the law firm on Meeting Street was a journey through a city I suddenly didn't recognize. The familiar pastel facades of historic homes, the rhythmic clip-clop of tourist carriages, the lush palmetto trees lining the avenues. It all seemed like a stage set for a play in which I was a minor, forgotten character. The city's famous charm felt sharp and mocking, a beauty that had no place for the ugliness I felt growing inside me. The humidity pressed in, making it hard to breathe. The law offices of Abernathy, Cole, and Finch were the complete opposite of my home. The air was frigid, sterile, smelling of lemon polish and old paper. Marble floors echoed my sensible heels, making me feel loud and intrusive. This was Arthur's world, a place of hard surfaces, cold transactions, and unassailable power. It was a world I had admired from a distance, content in my garden, never realizing its rules would one day be applied so mercilessly to me. My children were already there, standing awkwardly in the reception area. Daniel, in a suit that was too severe for Charleston, was checking his phone. My daughter, Sarah, who had flown in from Boston, was twisting the strap of her handbag, her face pale. They hugged me, but their embraces were stiff, their sympathy a performance for the receptionist. They looked at me with a kind of preemptive pity, as if I were already a problem they needed to solve. And then I saw her, Chloe, Arthur's executive assistant, standing near the window overlooking the street. She was exactly as I remembered from the company Christmas parties. Impossibly young, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and an impeccable navy suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She turned and gave me a small, practiced smile. It didn't reach her eyes. The scent of her perfume, something clean and expensive like white tea, cut through the stale office air. We were led into a conference room dominated by a long, gleaming mahogany table that felt as imposing as a coffin. I sat at one end, and my children instinctively took the chairs on either side, flanking me like honor guards at a funeral. Chloe sat opposite, next to the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, placing a sleek leather portfolio on the table. The space between us felt like a chasm. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mr. Abernathy, a man with a kind face and cruel, bureaucratic eyes, began to speak. His voice was a low, practiced monotone, designed to drain all life from the words he spoke. He droned on about legal entities, trusts, and tax provisions. The words washed over me. My mind drifted. I found myself staring at a small water stain on the ceiling tile, tracing its edges, thinking how it looked like the archipelago of the Florida Keys, where the ghost orchid grows. Wild. I felt as unmoored as an island. I was thinking about root systems, how some are shallow and spread wide, while others drive deep, anchoring a plant against any storm. I wondered what kind of roots my 50-year marriage had. Had they been strong and deep, or had they been a decorative, shallow network, easily ripped from the earth? The thought was so consuming that I almost missed the shift in the room, the subtle clearing of Mr. Abernathy's throat as he set aside one stack of papers and picked up a single, crisp sheet. He adjusted his reading glasses, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. The professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of what looked like genuine discomfort. The air in the room grew thin, charged with anticipation. My children both sat up a little straighter. Even Chloe seemed to hold her breath. "And now," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice dropping slightly, "we come to the matter of the liquid estate and personal bequests." The first word struck me with the force of a physical blow. "To Chloe Dubois," Mr. Abernathy read, his voice steady and clear. In gratitude for her unparalleled loyalty and companionship, I bequeath the entirety of my liquid assets." He paused, as if for effect, before naming the sum: $12 million. The number hung in the sterile air, obscene and unbelievable. A faint ringing started in my ears, blocking out all other sound. I forced myself to look at my children. Daniel's face was a mask of controlled fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of his chair. Sarah's mouth was slightly agape, her eyes wide with a look of utter, childlike disbelief. They were shocked not for me, but for themselves. Their inheritance had just vanished into the hands of a woman younger than both of them. Their concern was for the money, not for their mother's heart, which felt like it had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. My gaze then shifted across the vast, polished expanse of the table to Chloe. There was no shock on her face, no surprise, just a quiet, almost serene composure. She offered a minuscule, barely perceptible nod to Mr. Abernathy, a gesture of acknowledgement. She had known. This wasn't a surprise to her. It was a confirmation. The thought was a second blow, harder than the first. This wasn't a last-minute whim of a dying man. This was a plan. A long-held, carefully executed plan. Then, it was my turn. Mr. Abernathy's voice softened, taking on a tone of practiced professional sympathy that was more insulting than any shout. "To my wife of 50 years, Margaret Sterling," he read, and I could feel the pity of everyone in the room land on me like a heavy shroud. "I leave a single item." He paused again, and I held my breath, bracing for the final killing stroke. The old, rusted key to my office drawer. He wasn't finished. The sentence had a coda, a final twist of the knife designed for maximum pain. "So she may remember," he continued, the words dropping like stones into the silence, "that not all old things have value." There it was, the public declaration of my worthlessness. My entire life, my loyalty, my love, all reduced to a piece of old, rusted metal. The humiliation was so complete, so profound, it stole the air from my lungs. With a soft scraping sound, Mr. Abernathy pushed a small object across the table. It was a heavy iron key, tagged with a yellowed paper label bearing Arthur's spidery handwriting. "Office." It slid across the gleaming mahogany and came to a stop directly in front of me. It was ugly, stained with rust, a forgotten thing from a forgotten drawer, a symbol of my new status. I was discarded refuse. My hand trembled violently as I reached for it. The metal was cold, colder than the room, and its rough, rusted texture was an abrasive shock against my skin. I wrapped my fingers around it, my knuckles turning white. I could feel their eyes on me, the lawyer's pity, my children's stunned irrelevance, and Chloe's cool, victorious gaze. I was a specimen under glass, the subject of a cruel social experiment. In that moment, I was utterly and completely alone. Daniel and Sarah were lost in their own shock and financial loss, too weak or too selfish to speak up for me. They were their father's children, after all, intimidated by his power even in death. There was no one to defend my honor, no one to decry the cruelty. The structure of my family, the very world I had built, had just collapsed, leaving me in the ruins. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I stood up. The key was a leaden weight in my fist. The faces around the table blurred into a watercolor of pity and triumph. I didn't say a word. There were no words for this. All I knew was the cold, hard reality of the key in my palm and the crushing finality of Arthur's last message. I felt encurralado, cornered, not by the four walls of that room, but by the narrative of my own life, which had just been publicly rewritten as a footnote in someone else's story. I walked out of that conference room without looking back. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze on my shoulders, a mixture of pity, discomfort, and in Chloe's case, something I could only describe as cool, clinical victory. My children scurried after me, their footsteps echoing mine in the marble hall. In the elevator, the silence was thick and suffocating. Sarah finally broke it, her voice a reedy whisper. "Mother, I am so sorry. Can't believe. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. I knew what she couldn't believe, that her inheritance was gone. My humiliation was just the collateral damage. The ride home in the hired car was a blur of palmetto trees and pastel-colored facades. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, was already on his phone, likely speaking to his own lawyer, his voice a low, angry murmur. Sarah just stared out the window, tears silently tracing paths down her powdered cheeks. I sat between them, a ghost in gray silk, clutching the rusty key in my fist so tightly that its jagged edges dug into my palm. The physical pain was a welcome distraction, a sharp, real sensation in a world that had just dissolved into a nightmare. I was invisible to them, a problem to be managed later. When we arrived at the house, they helped me out of the car with a delicate, dutiful reverence they hadn't shown in years. "We'll sort this out, Mother," Daniel said, his jaw tight. "We'll contest it. This is elder abuse. Undue influence." He used legal terms as a shield, distancing himself from the raw human betrayal of it all. They wanted to fight for the money. It never occurred to them to ask if I was all right, to hold my hand, to simply sit with me in the crushing silence of the home Arthur had just ripped away from me. I sent them away. I told them I needed to rest, that I would call them in the morning. The relief on their faces was palpable. They had performed their duty and were now free to retreat to their hotel rooms to strategize, to mourn their lost millions. I closed the heavy front door behind them and leaned against it, the cool, solid wood a comfort against my back. The house was utterly silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a tomb. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing over the furniture we had chosen together. The Georgian sideboard, the Persian rugs, the paintings of the low-country marshes. Every object was a memory, and every memory was now tainted, recontextualized as a prop in a 50-year deception. Was any of it real? Had his hand on my back been a lie? Were the whispered words in the dark just a performance? The man I had loved, or thought I loved, had been a stranger, and this house was his stage. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. My feet carried me, as they always did, to the conservatory. The humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids, enveloped me like a blanket. Here, things made sense. There was life, death, and the stubborn, silent struggle for survival. I sank onto the small wrought iron bench, my body feeling impossibly heavy. My gaze fell upon the ghost orchid, its spectral white flowers seeming to float in the dusky light. It survives by clinging to another, its roots exposed to the air, drawing sustenance from nothing but the atmosphere. I felt a kinship with its precarious existence. Finally, I opened my hand and looked at the source of my shame. The key was heavy, made of dark, pitted iron, coated in a layer of deep orange rust that flaked off on my skin. The tag, yellowed with age, simply read, "Office." It was an ugly, forgotten thing. Arthur's final judgment. Not all old things have value. The words echoed in my mind, a cruel, endless loop. My first impulse was to walk to the battery and hurl it into the harbor, to let the salt water finish what time had started and dissolve it into nothing. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, turning it over and over in my fingers, studying it with the same intensity I would a new, unidentifiable plant specimen. The botanist in me, the woman who had been dormant for so long, began to stir. I observed its structure, the specific pattern of the rust, the way the metal was worn down in certain places. In nature, nothing is ever just what it seems. A dull-colored seed holds a riot of color. A toxic leaf can contain a cure. Decay is not an end, but a transformation. The rust wasn't uniform. It was thickest around the head of the key, but near the teeth it was thinner, as if worn away by repeated use long ago. The thought struck me as odd. Why would a worthless, forgotten key show signs of wear? Arthur was meticulous. If something had no value, he discarded it. He didn't keep it. He didn't label it. He didn't create an elaborate, cruel pantomime in his will just to hand it to me. The cruelty was there, yes, but it felt inefficient and Arthur was never inefficient. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Years ago, I had found him in his study, staring at a withered brown orchid bulb I was about to throw away. "Don't," he had said, his voice unusually soft. "Sometimes the most valuable things look like they're dead. They're just waiting for the right conditions to show you what's inside." He was talking about a plant, but the look in his eye was distant, thoughtful. He was a man of business, a man of numbers, but he understood the hidden potential in things. I looked down at the key again. The rust. It wasn't just decay. On some metals, under the right conditions, a layer of oxidation can form a protective coating, a patina that shields the core metal from further corrosion. It was a defense mechanism. The ugly, worthless exterior was protecting something underneath. My breath caught in my throat. Not all old things have value. What if it wasn't a statement, but a challenge? A riddle only I could solve? He knew me. He knew how my mind worked. He knew I wouldn't see a rusty key. I would see a specimen. I would see a process, a history. Chloe, for all her sharp intelligence and business acumen, would have seen only an insult. She would have tossed it aside without a second thought, blinded by her $12 million victory. My children, lost in their own financial grief, wouldn't have even registered its existence. It was meant for me. The thought was a spark in the darkness, a flicker of something other than pain. This wasn't a final act of cruelty. It was a final move in a long, complicated chess game I never even knew we were playing. Arthur had lived in a world of secrets, of transactions and hidden clauses. He wouldn't leave his life's work, his legacy, in a straightforward will for lawyers and accountants to dissect. He would hide it. He would lock it away, and he would leave the key with the one person he knew would either throw it away in disgust or look close enough to understand its true purpose. A cold, clarifying anger began to replace the hot burn of humiliation. He had underestimated me for 50 years. Everyone had. The fragile orchid lady, the graceful hostess, the quiet, supportive wife. They saw the flower, but never the root system, the tough, resilient, intricate network that held everything together. They saw Margaret Sterling, the wife of a magnate. They had no idea who Margaret the botanist was. It was time to reintroduce myself. I stood up from the bench, the iron legs scraping against the stone floor. The key no longer felt like a weight in my hand. It felt like a tool, a weapon. The tag said, "Office." We had an office here in the house, a grand mahogany-paneled room that Arthur had used less and less in his later years, preferring his downtown headquarters. The drawer. The will had been specific. The old, rusted key to my office drawer. It had to be there. I walked out of the conservatory, leaving the humid sanctuary behind. The air in the main house felt cooler, sharper. I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. Each step was firm, deliberate. I was no longer a grieving widow drifting through the ruins of her life. I was a scientist with a puzzle to solve, a mystery to unravel. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache in my soul, but it was now overlaid with something new. Resolve. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. I was afraid. I was terrified of what I might find in that drawer. Proof of more lies? More secrets? Or worse, what if I found nothing at all? What if it truly was just a drawer full of old paperclips and dried-up pens? And Arthur's final act was indeed a simple, brutal gesture of contempt. The doubt was a cold whisper, trying to pull me back into the fog of despair. I paused at the foot of the grand staircase, my hand on the polished banister. I could turn back. I could go to my room, take a sleeping pill, and let the lawyers and my children fight over the scraps. I could accept my new role as the pitiable, discarded wife. I could wither away, just as everyone expected me to. The image of the ghost orchid flashed in my mind again, leafless, seemingly dead for years, clinging to life until the moment it was ready to bloom. No, I would not wither. I would bloom. I tightened my grip on the key, the metal now warm from my skin. Arthur had set the board. He had made his move. Now, it was my turn. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and old memories, and started to climb the stairs, one slow, steady step at a time, heading toward his office. The silence of the house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I reached the second-floor landing and walked down the long, carpeted hallway. The portraits of sterling ancestors watched me pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow me with stern judgment. For 50 years, I had tried to live up to their legacy, to be the woman this house and this family required. I had played my part perfectly, but the play was over. The curtain had fallen, and I was the only one left on the stage. The office door was at the end of the hall. It was a heavy, dark oak door that was almost always kept closed. It was Arthur's private domain, a place I rarely entered. It smelled of leather, old books, and the faint, spicy scent of his aftershave that still lingered in the air. I stood before it for a long moment, listening to the frantic beating of my own heart. This was the threshold. Crossing, it meant I could never go back to being the woman I was that morning. My hand was trembling again, but not from weakness. It was trembling with a strange, fierce energy, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I looked down at the key in my other hand. It was no longer a symbol of my worthlessness. It was a symbol of my intelligence, the one thing Arthur had both respected and, I now realized, feared. He had given me the one weapon that could cut through his web of lies, betting that I wouldn't have the courage to use it. He was wrong. With a resolve that felt as if it were forged in the very core of my being, I placed my free hand on the cold brass doorknob. The metal was smooth and unyielding. The silence in the hallway was absolute, a perfect vacuum waiting for a sound to break it. I took one last, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the stale air of my old life. Then, I turned the knob. The latch clicked with a loud, definitive sound that echoed down the empty hall. The door swung inward, opening into the darkness of the room where Arthur's secrets were kept. I stepped across the threshold, my knuckles white around the rusted key, ready to unlock whatever truth was waiting for me inside. The game had begun. The air inside Arthur's office was stagnant, thick with the scent of decaying paper, leather polish, and a faint, lingering trace of his cigar smoke. It was a masculine space, dark wood and heavy draperies absorbing the afternoon light, a world I had always observed, but never truly entered. My first move was born of pure, desperate hope. I walked directly to the grand mahogany desk that dominated the room and tried the rusty key on the main central drawer. It didn't fit. I tried the side drawers one by one. Nothing. A cold wave of despair washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. Was this it? Was the final joke on me, the key a meaningless piece of metal leading to nowhere? I sank into the stiff leather chair behind the desk, his chair, and the humiliation from the lawyer's office returned with a vengeance. I felt foolish, a deluded old woman playing a game whose rules I didn't understand. My son's voice echoed in my head, urging legal action, the sensible path. This search felt like madness, a refusal to accept the ugly truth. I stared at the key in my palm, its rusted surface mocking me. For a long moment, I considered giving up, calling Daniel, and admitting defeat. The narrative they had written for me, the fragile, grieving widow, was so much easier to accept than this uncertain, painful path. But then my eyes landed on the bookshelves that lined the walls, floor to ceiling. They were meticulously organized, not by author or title, but by subject. Maritime law, shipping routes, naval history, cartography. It was Arthur's mind, laid bare. A mind that prized order, systems, and hidden knowledge. The botanist in me, the part of me that understood classification and complex systems, stirred from its long slumber. I realized my mistake. I had approached the problem emotionally, looking for the most obvious answer. Arthur was never obvious. This wasn't a simple lock. It was a puzzle, and the office was the ecosystem in which I had to find the solution. My approach shifted. I began not with the key, but with observation. For the next few days, a new routine took hold. I would spend my mornings with my orchids, drawing strength from their silent resilience, and my afternoons in his office, armed with a notepad a magnifying glass, and a thermos of Earl Grey tea. I started to catalog the room, not as a wife looking for memories, but as a scientist conducting fieldwork. I documented the books, the maps pinned to the walls, the strange nautical instruments displayed on the mantelpiece. I was no longer grieving in this house. I was investigating it. The work was slow and methodical, a balm to my fractured soul. It gave me purpose beyond sorrow. Instead of being haunted by memories of Arthur the Yao, husband, I was now engaging with the mind of Arthur the strategist. I ran my fingers over the spines of his books, feeling the worn leather, imagining him sitting here, plotting his next move. The room began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like an archive, a place of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The fear of what I might find was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning curiosity. One afternoon, Daniel called again. His voice was sharp with impatience. "Mother, have you called the attorneys I recommended? Chloe's lawyers are probably already entrenching themselves. You're sitting in that house doing nothing while she runs away with our family's legacy." His words were a blow, intended to wound and to motivate. He couldn't comprehend what I was doing. To him, this was about money and legal battles, about winning and losing in a world he understood. He saw my quiet search as a sign of weakness, of a mind unhinged by grief. His criticism ignited a fresh wave of self-doubt. Was I being a fool? Was I chasing a ghost, a fantasy of a hidden meaning where there was only cruelty? I looked around the dusty office, at my neat stacks of notes, and for a moment, I saw it through his eyes. The pathetic hobby of a lonely old woman, the old Margaret, the one who always deferred, who always tried to keep the peace, wanted to apologize and promised to call the lawyers immediately. But then I looked at the key, resting on my notepad. It wasn't just a key. It was a question Arthur had asked me, and only me. I would not let my son's impatience bully me out of finding the answer. "I'm handling it my way, Daniel," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. The conversation ended curtly, leaving a chill in the air. The conflict was a clarifying fire. It solidified my resolve. My children, in their grief and greed, had aligned themselves with the world of lawyers and contracts, Arthur's public world. But I was venturing into his private one. This was my fight, and I would fight it with my own weapons: patience, observation, and an understanding of the man that no one else possessed. I was no longer just defending my honor. I was reclaiming my own mind. A week into my search, I found the first real anomaly. It was in a thick, heavy volume on the history of Charleston's port. Tucked inside was a very old pressed flower, a native climbing orchid, Vanilla Dilloniana. It was a species I had written a paper on decades ago before I married Arthur. It was marking a chapter on smuggling tunnels and secret passages used during the Prohibition era. The flower was a message, a breadcrumb left specifically for the botanist, not the wife. My heart began to beat faster. This was not a coincidence. This was a signpost. The chapter described how wealthy merchants built hidden compartments into their homes and offices to hide illicit goods. They were masters of deception, using false walls, hollowed-out furniture, and intricate locking mechanisms that were invisible to the naked eye. I read the words over and over, the scent of the old paper filling my senses. I looked up from the book and saw the mahogany desk not as a piece of furniture, but as a potential vessel, a ship with a secret cargo hold. Arthur, a shipping magnate, would have appreciated the history and the symbolism. My investigation of the desk became an obsession. I was no longer just looking at it, I was dissecting it. I measured its dimensions, comparing them to blueprints of antique desks I found in another book. I tapped every inch of its surface, listening for variations in the sound, for the telltale hollow echo that would indicate a hidden space. My hands, once delicate enough to pollinate the tiniest orchid blossom, were now covered in dust and furniture polish. They felt stronger, more capable than they had in years. I was on my knees, a 72-year-old woman crawling under a desk, feeling for latches, for anything out of place. I found it on the third day of my intensive search. It wasn't a lock in the traditional sense. Behind the carved knee-hole panel, my fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the wood. It was a keyhole, but not for a modern key. It was shaped to fit the jagged, irregular teeth of the old iron key I held in my pocket. It had been hidden in plain sight the entire time, a secret disguised by ornate decoration. My breath caught in my throat. This was it, the moment of truth. My hand trembled as I retrieved the key. The rust flaked under my fingers as I guided it toward the hidden opening. For a terrifying second, I thought it wouldn't fit, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then, with a gentle push, it slid home. The fit was perfect. Snug. I turned it slowly, the metal groaning in protest after decades of disuse. There was a low, satisfying thunk from deep within the structure of the desk. It was the sound of a secret finally giving way. I pulled my hand back and waited a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pushed gently on the carved wooden panel. It didn't move. My heart sank. Had I been wrong? But then I remembered the book. These mechanisms were often complex. I pushed again, this time sliding it to the left instead of pushing inward. With a soft scraping sound, a section of the pedestal, which I had assumed was solid wood, slid open, revealing a dark, narrow cavity. It wasn't a drawer. It was a hidden safe. Deposit box, built into the very bones of the desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for old-fashioned bookkeeping. It was heavy, its cover worn smooth with time. There was no title, no label. It was completely anonymous. I lifted it out, its weight feeling immense, significant in my hands. The air in the room seemed to stand still, charged with the energy of a 50-year-old secret about to be exposed. This was Arthur's real vault. I carried the ledger to the top of the desk, clearing a space amidst my notes and books. I sat down in his chair, the leather creaking under my weight. For a moment, I just stared at the cover, my mind racing. Every possibility was a new kind of fear. Would it contain evidence of crimes? A list of other women? A confession of his contempt for me? Whatever was inside, I knew it would irrevocably change my understanding of the man I had married and the life I had lived. There was no turning back now. With a deep, steadying breath, I opened the cover. The first page was not filled with numbers and figures. It was filled with Arthur's familiar, spidery handwriting. But the date at the top of the page stopped me cold. It was from our first year of marriage, and the first line was not about business. It read, "A second set of books. Not for the taxman, but for the truth. Margaret must never know the foundation upon which this family is built. Her goodness is the one thing I cannot bear to corrupt." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, but it was not a blow of cruelty. It was one of complexity, of a hidden motive so much deeper than I could have ever imagined. He wasn't insulting me with that key. He was trusting me. He was trusting the botanist, the scientist, the one person who would look past the ugly exterior to find the hidden truth. He had built a prison of lies to protect me, and then, at the very end, he had left me the only key to its door. I slowly turned the page, and then another. It was all there. A shadow ledger detailing every secret deal, every shell corporation, every asset he had hidden over the decades. Not from the government, but from his business partners, his rivals, and even his own children. He had built a second secret empire, parallel to the one everyone knew, and according to the meticulous notes in the margins, this hidden empire was vastly larger than the one he had publicly bequeathed. My children were wrong. Chloe was wrong. The lawyers were wrong. The $12 million she had received was not the bulk of the estate. It was a misdirection. A bright, shiny object designed to draw everyone's attention while the real prize lay dormant, waiting for me. He had given his mistress the cash, a handsome but finite reward. He had given me the kingdom, the source of the wealth itself, locked away where only I could find it. I leaned back in the chair, the heavy ledger resting in my lap. The kid guy. Silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. The weight of humiliation that had been crushing my spirit for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. I was not the discarded relic. I was the sole heir. I was not the victim of his final act of cruelty. I was the executor of his final, brilliant, and deeply complicated act of love. A slow smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile in months. It was not a smile of joy, but of power. The woman who had walked into this room days ago, a fragile widow clutching a rusty key, was gone. In her place sat a woman who held the truth in her hands. Arthur had spent 50 years underestimating me, and in the end, he had placed his entire legacy on the bet that I would finally prove him wrong. I looked out the window at the setting sun, its golden light bathing the Charleston harbor in a soft glow. The world outside had not changed, but I had. The grief was still there, a permanent part of my soul's landscape, but it was no longer a debilitating fog. It was a mountain from which I could now see everything clearly. I was not at the end of my story. I was at the very beginning. My name is Margaret Sterling, and I was about to reintroduce myself to the world, not as the quiet, grieving widow or the fragile orchid lady, but as the woman who held the key to an empire. My journey of transformation wasn't over. It had just found its direction. The game Arthur had started was not finished. It was simply my turn to make a move, and I finally knew exactly how I was going to play. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in Arthur's leather chair, the heavy ledger open on the desk before me, a single lamp casting a pool of golden light on the pages. The house was silent, but my mind was a whirlwind of activity. I read every entry, traced every transaction, and absorbed 50 years of a secret life. With each page, the image of Arthur the cruel husband dissolved, replaced by something far more complex. A master strategist who had built a fortress of wealth and left the only key with the one person he believed was either too fragile to use it or intelligent enough to deserve it. He had gambled on the botanist. The first tangible step of my new life was not a phone call to my children. It was a call to a woman whose name I found in the ledger's margins, noted as a fierce mind. Eleanor Vance, a corporate lawyer in Atlanta known for dismantling hostile takeovers, not for handling probate disputes. When I reached her at 7 in the morning, my voice was steady. I didn't sound like a grieving widow. I introduced myself as Margaret Sterling, the sole proprietor of the Sterling Shadow Holdings, and simply said, "I have a complex estate to secure. I require the best." The silence on the other end was brief before she replied, "I'll be in Charleston by afternoon." The contrast between the woman I was and the woman I was becoming was stark. The old Margaret would have agonized over the decision, sought her son's approval, and been intimidated by a lawyer like Eleanor. The new Margaret moved with the quiet, decisive efficiency of a natural force. I spent the morning not in my conservatory, but in the office, organizing my notes, cross-referencing the ledger with old bank statements I found locked away. My hands, which had trembled holding the key, were now firm as they highlighted discrepancies and drafted a strategy. The fragility had been baked away, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. I summoned them all back to the offices of Abernathy, Cole, and Finch 2 days later. I chose the same conference room, the scene of my greatest humiliation. This time, however, I did not arrive as a guest. I arrived with Eleanor Vance at my side, and we were shown to the room to wait. When my children and Chloe entered, their faces were a mixture of confusion and irritation. Daniel started immediately. "Mother, what is this? I told you we needed a different strategy, not another meeting here." He saw me as the same lost elderly woman, a pawn in a game he was trying to manage. Chloe sat opposite me, her composure as flawless as ever, though a flicker of curiosity danced in her sharp eyes. She likely assumed I had come to beg for a settlement, to appeal to her sense of decency. My children thought I was there to mount a feeble, emotional challenge to the will. They all saw the woman from the week before, the relic, the forgotten thing. They had no idea they were looking at the new owner of the board, a queen who had been hiding as a pawn all along. The air was thick with their misjudgments, a perfect stage for the truth. I said nothing. I simply nodded to Eleanor. She opened her briefcase and produced not legal briefs, but the heavy, leather-bound ledger. She placed it on the center of the mahogany table with a solid, definitive thud that silenced the room. "This," Eleanor began, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "is the primary codicil to Arthur Sterling's estate. It predates the official will by several decades and details the disposition of assets that were never part of the public record." She opened it to a specific page, a summary of holdings that made the $12 million given to Chloe look like a rounding error. The color drained from Chloe's face. For the first time since I had met her, her mask of cool professionalism shattered, replaced by raw, unfiltered disbelief. She stared at the ledger as if it were a ghost. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers, his jaw slackening with every zero he counted. Sarah simply put a hand to her mouth, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. Their world, built on the foundation of Arthur's public success, was being redrawn before their very eyes, and they were no longer at its center. "The document is ironclad," Eleanor continued, her tone clinical. "It establishes a private trust, with Margaret Sterling as its sole trustee and beneficiary. The $12 million bequeathed in the public will were a severance payment, drawn from a minor corporate account. The true Sterling estate, the shipping lines, the real estate holdings, the offshore accounts, they are all hers." She looked directly at me, and for the first time in that room, I was the one holding all the power. The pity in their eyes had been replaced by a stunning, shocking awe. My children were speechless. The fight they had been planning on my behalf was suddenly irrelevant. They weren't fighting for me. They were fighting for a sliver of an inheritance they now realized they had never been entitled to. The humiliation I had felt was now mirrored on their faces, the dawning horror that they had been so focused on the cash that they had completely missed the kingdom. They had looked at the rusty key and seen junk. They had looked at their mother and seen a helpless old woman. They had been wrong on both counts. In the weeks that followed, my life transformed. The quiet solitude of my home was replaced by a hum of activity. Accountants, lawyers, and investment managers now came to the house on Broad Street, sitting in the very parlor where I once hosted garden club meetings. I made decisions that would have terrified me a month ago. I liquidated certain high-risk assets, consolidated shipping routes, and established a new board of directors for the core company, appointing Eleanor Vance as its chair. I was not a figurehead. I was the architect of the new Sterling legacy. The greatest change, however, was intangible. It was the way people looked at me. The condescending pity was gone, replaced by a palpable respect, and in some cases, a healthy dose of fear. My son Daniel, once so dismissive, now spoke to me with a cautious deference, asking for my opinion on market trends. His respect was born of power, not love, and I understood that distinction perfectly. It was a currency Arthur had understood, and one I was quickly learning to wield with precision. Sarah was different. She called me one evening, her voice soft and full of a shame that felt genuine. "I'm so sorry, Mother," she whispered. "We saw you as fragile. We never saw how strong you were. We never really saw you." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. It was not a complete healing of the wound, but it was a start, a recognition of the woman I had been all along, hidden beneath the title of wife and mother. As for Chloe, she vanished. She took her $12 million and disappeared, a ghost from a life that no longer existed. The ledger revealed that her unparalleled loyalty and companionship had been a fiction. She had been a formidable business partner to Arthur in his later years, a brilliant but ruthless operator. The money wasn't a gift of love. It was a final, transactional payment for services rendered, a golden parachute to ensure her silence and cooperation in the grand misdirection. My life found a new rhythm. I still spent my mornings in the conservatory, but it was no longer a sanctuary to hide from the world. It was my command center. Tending to my orchids, I found clarity. The patience required to coax a bloom from a stubborn plant was the same patience I now applied to my business dealings. Nature had been my greatest teacher all along, preparing me for a world I never thought I would have to navigate. I was, in the end, simply cultivating a different kind of garden. I established the Sterling Foundation for Botanical Research, pouring millions into the preservation of rare and endangered species, particularly orchids. I funded expeditions to the Florida Keys to study the ghost orchid in its natural habitat, the very plant that had given me solace in my darkest hour. My old life as a botanist was not a separate, forgotten chapter. It was the root system from which my new strength had grown. I was finally integrating all the parts of myself into one whole. Looking back, I see the old Margaret Sterling as a dormant bulb. Everything she needed to bloom was already inside her. The intelligence, the resilience, the quiet strength. She was just waiting for the right conditions, however harsh, to force her to break through the surface. The humiliation I endured was not an ending. It was the cold, hard winter that precedes the spring. It was the necessary fire that burns away the dead undergrowth so that new life can emerge. Arthur's final act was not one of simple cruelty or love. It was a test. A final, complex puzzle from a man who lived his life as a series of strategic games. He built an empire on secrets, and then wagered its entire existence on my ability to see the value in something everyone else had discarded. He did not leave me his fortune in spite of my quiet, observant nature. He left it to me because of it. It was the ultimate, albeit painful, acknowledgement of the woman he knew I was. My relationship with my children has changed forever. It is now built on a foundation of truth, however uncomfortable. They see me not as a dependent, but as the matriarch of the family, the guardian of a legacy they are now privileged to be a part of, not entitled to inherit. We are slowly, carefully, learning to communicate not as a CEO and her subordinates, but as a mother and her children, finding our way back to each other across a landscape forever altered by the truth. I often hold the old, rusted key in my hand. It sits on my desk now, a paperweight, on top of financial reports worth billions. It is no longer a symbol of shame. It is a reminder that the most valuable things in this world are often hidden, overlooked, and underestimated. It reminds me that rust is not just decay. It can be a protective layer, shielding a core of incredible strength and purpose. The world is full of rusty keys and forgotten things. People, especially women of a certain age, are often relegated to the attic of life, labeled as old, fragile, and without value. We are told our time is past, that our purpose is fulfilled. We are handed a narrative of gentle decline and quiet dignity, and we are expected to play our part gracefully. But within each of us is a hidden lock, a secret strength waiting for the right key. My story is not about inheriting a fortune. It is about inheriting my own power. It is about the moment I stopped accepting the valuation others placed on me and started to conduct my own appraisal. The ledger did not give me my worth. It simply unlocked the worth that was there all along. The greatest conquest was not taking control of an empire, but taking control of my own narrative. To anyone who has ever been made to feel small, discarded, or invisible, I say this: look closer. The things they call your weaknesses, your quiet nature, your patience, your attention to small details, may be your greatest weapons in disguise. Do not let anyone else's definition of your value become your own. You are not a forgotten object in someone else's drawer. You are the key. You are the ledger. You are the entire hidden empire. All you have to do is find the courage to turn the lock, open the book, and claim what has been yours all along. The world may not see it yet, but your most spectacular bloom is still to come. You just have to be brave enough to grow. My name is Margaret Sterling. I am 72 years old, and I am not a relic of the past. I am the architect of the future. The ghost orchid in my conservatory has just bloomed again. Its ethereal white flowers a testament to the fact that even things that appear to have nothing can produce the most breathtaking beauty. It reminds me, every single day, that my story is far from over,